When a desperate woman trades her mother's wedding dress for her last meal in the unforgiving Dakota Territory of 1867, she believes she's lost everything that ever defined her worth. But a mysterious rancher's unexpected offer will force her to discover whether true value comes from what you own, or who you choose to become. Snow began falling on Deadwood like tiny frozen tears, and Evangeline Hayes pressed her face against the cold window of Morrison's general store. Her breath made small clouds on the glass as she watched people hurry past with thick coats and full bellies. She had neither. The ivory silk dress lay spread across the wooden counter behind her like a ghost from another life. Pearl buttons caught the lamplight, each one worth more than most folks in the Dakota Territory earned in a week. But pretty buttons couldn't fill an empty stomach or pay for a warm place to sleep. "This belonged to my mother," Evangeline whispered, running her fingers along the delicate lace trim. "She wore it when she married my father in Boston, back when we had money and respect." The autumn of 1867 had been cruel to everyone in the territory, but especially cruel to a young woman with no family and no skills except playing piano and speaking proper English. Those talents meant nothing when winter was coming and your last coin had been spent 3 days ago. Her stomach made a low, angry sound. She pressed her hand against it, trying to make the hunger stop. When had she last eaten a real meal? Tuesday? Wednesday? The days blurred together when all you thought about was food. $20, she told herself firmly. Mr. Morrison said he might pay $20 for good silk. That's enough for food and a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house for almost 2 weeks. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her heart like cold air through a broken window. What would happen after 2 weeks? What would she do when the money ran out and winter truly arrived? The bell above the door jingled, making her jump. A woman entered, shaking snow from her woolen shawl. She had kind eyes and rosy cheeks, the look of someone who never wondered where her next meal would come from. "Afternoon, dear," the woman said, noticing Evangeline's thin frame and worn clothes. "Terrible weather for traveling. Are you new to Deadwood?" "Yes, ma'am," Evangeline replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I came west with my father to work his mining claim, but he passed last spring." The woman's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss, child. Mining is dangerous work, and the fever took so many last year. Do you have other family?" "No, ma'am. Just me now." "And what brings you to Morrison's store today?" Evangeline's cheeks burned with shame, but honesty seemed easier than lies. "I'm hoping to sell something so I can eat." The woman glanced at the wedding dress on the counter, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Oh, honey, that's a beautiful gown. It must mean a great deal to you." "It's all I have left of her," Evangeline admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't eat memories." Before the kind woman could respond, heavy footsteps announced Morrison's return from the back room. He was a large man with suspicious eyes and hands that looked like they'd never known honest work. His gaze moved from Evangeline to the dress, calculating its worth like a butcher eyeing cattle. "Well now, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice oily with false concern. "Have you decided to accept my offer?" "What offer was that?" the other woman asked, her tone suddenly sharp. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "I offered the young lady $15 for her dress. It's generous, considering the limited market for such fancy items in our little town." $15? The woman's eyebrows rose. "For French silk and handmade lace? Mr. Morrison, that dress is worth at least $50, even out here." "Now, Mrs. Hartwell, you know I have to consider storage costs, the difficulty of finding buyers." "Nonsense." Mrs. Hartwell moved closer to examine the dress, her experienced fingers testing the quality of the fabric. "This is museum-quality work. The embroidery alone took someone months to complete." Evangeline felt a spark of hope. "You really think it's worth more?" "I know it is, dear. I ran a dress shop in Chicago before my husband brought me west. This gown was made by someone who truly understood their craft." Morrison's face darkened. "Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps you should mind your own business. The young lady and I were conducting a private transaction." A transaction that smells suspiciously like theft, Mrs. Hartwell replied coolly. Miss Hayes, you don't have to accept the first offer you receive. There are other options. Such as? Evangeline asked, hope and desperation warring in her chest. Well, there's the hotel in the next town over. The owner's wife has been looking for something special for her daughter's wedding. Or perhaps we could find you work instead of forcing you to sell your treasures. Morrison stepped forward, his bulk casting a shadow over the counter. Mrs. Hartwell, I think you're filling this young lady's head with impossible dreams. Work is scarce, especially for someone with no practical skills. My offer is fair and immediate. The two adults faced each other across the counter like gunfighters at dawn, while Evangeline stood between them with her mother's dress and her growling stomach and the terrible knowledge that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering the muddy streets of Deadwood in deceptive white beauty. Soon the mountain passes would be blocked, trapping everyone in the territory until spring. Whatever decision she made today would have to last her through the long, cold months ahead. Her hands trembled as she touched the silk one more time, remembering her mother's smile on her wedding day, remembering the hope and love that had seemed so permanent back then. Now those memories felt as fragile as the silk beneath her fingers. I need to think, she said finally, her voice small in the tension-filled store. Of course you do, Mrs. Hartwell said gently. But don't think too long, dear. And don't let anyone pressure you into making a choice you'll regret. Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. The offer won't stand forever, Miss Hayes. Come morning, it might be considerably less generous. As the two customers left the store together, Evangeline remained alone with her mother's dress and the weight of an impossible choice. Sell now for far less than it was worth, or risk waiting for a better offer that might never come while her strength faded and the snow piled higher outside the door. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the gathering storm. The Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with the kind of energy that came from men celebrating another day of surviving the frontier, and Evangeline Hayes sat in the darkest corner booth, making her bowl of beef stew last as long as humanly possible. Morrison's $15 had bought her this meal and a night at the boarding house, but tomorrow would bring new hunger and new desperation. The saloon was no place for a respectable woman, but respectability was a luxury she could no longer afford. Besides, the warmth from the big stone fireplace felt wonderful against her back, and the sounds of laughter and conversation made her feel less alone in the world. Another whiskey, Jake? Called the bartender to a cowboy at the bar. Keep 'em coming, Pete. It's too cold to be sober tonight. Evangeline spooned up another tiny bit of beef, chewing slowly to make it last. The meat was tough and the vegetables were overcooked, but it was the first hot meal she'd had in 4 days. Her body felt like it was coming back to life with each bite. Excuse me, miss. She looked up to see a man standing beside her table, hat in his hands. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered skin and the kind of calloused hands that came from real work. His clothes were clean but mended in several places, and his boots were worn but well cared for. Might I sit for a moment? He asked, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't quite place. I don't mean to bother you, but I saw you at Morrison's store earlier today. Evangeline's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. Had he been watching her humiliation? I'm not sure what you mean, sir. Name's William McKenna, he said, settling into the chair across from her without waiting for permission. I run cattle about 20 miles south of here, down in Willow Creek Valley. She studied his face, looking for signs of the kind of man who approached lone women in saloons. But his eyes were direct and honest, and he kept his hands visible on the table between them. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Morrison, he continued, about needing work. Heat crept up Evangeline's neck. If you're looking for companionship, Mr. McKenna, I'm afraid you've mistaken me for someone else. His face went red as a summer sunset. No, miss, nothing like that. I'm looking for help with my ranch. Someone to keep house, cook meals, tend the garden. The work's honest and the pay is fair. What kind of pay? She asked, suspicious of anything that sounded too good to be true. Room and board, plus $30 a month. It's hard work, but it's steady, and you'd have a safe place to spend the winter. $30 a month. More money than she'd ever earned. More than she'd dared to hope for. But something in his manner, the way he looked past her when he mentioned needing help, suggested there was more to his story. "Why me?" she asked. "Surely there are other women in town who could use work." William was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who deserved better than she got from the world." The sadness in his voice made her chest tight. "Your wife was. Catherine died 2 winters ago. Influenza took her when the snows came early." He met her eyes again. "The house is too big for one person, too quiet. I thought maybe it would be good for both of us." Around them, the saloon continued its nightly celebration, but at their table, silence stretched like a rope pulled tight. Evangeline tried to read the truth in William's face, to understand what he wasn't saying. "What would my duties be exactly?" she asked. "Cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden. Maybe some mending and such. Nothing improper, I give you my word on that. You'd have your own room, and I'd respect your privacy completely. And if it doesn't work out, if we don't suit each other's temperaments, then I'd pay your way back to town and give you enough money to get by until you found something else. But I think it might work out fine. You strike me as someone who's not afraid of hard work." A burst of laughter from the bar made them both look toward the crowd of cowboys and miners who were celebrating something involving dice and a lot of whiskey. When Evangeline turned back, she found William watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why didn't you just place an advertisement in the newspaper? Why approach a stranger in a saloon?" William's smile was rueful. "Because the kind of woman who answers newspaper advertisements for ranch work usually has expectations. They come looking for a husband, not a job. I'm not ready for that kind of complication." His honesty was refreshing after Morrison's obvious attempts to cheat her. "And you think I'm not looking for a husband? I think you're looking for survival. Same as me." The bluntness of his words should have offended her, but instead they brought relief. Here was someone who understood desperation without judging it, someone who offered help without expecting gratitude or submission in return. "The weather's getting worse," he continued, glancing toward the windows where snow was beginning to pile against the glass. "If you're going to make a decision, it should be soon. The roads will be impassable by tomorrow night." Evangeline looked down at her empty bowl, then back at the strange man who offered her a lifeline when she'd nearly given up hope. "What's the ranch like?" "Peaceful. Good water, good grass for the cattle. The house is solid, built to last. There's even a piano, if you're inclined toward music." Piano. She hadn't touched piano keys since leaving Boston, hadn't dared to hope she might play again. "Your wife played. Every evening after supper." It made the whole place feel more like home. The longing in his voice was unmistakable, and Evangeline felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy. Would she always be a replacement for the woman he'd truly loved? "I should tell you," she said carefully, "I'm not much of a cook. In Boston, we had servants for that. I can teach you what you need to know. Cooking for ranch hands isn't complicated. They'll eat anything as long as there's plenty of it. And I've never tended a garden. Catherine started a good one. The plants know what to do. They mostly just need water and weeding." He had an answer for every concern, a solution for every problem. It should have made her suspicious, but instead it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, things might work out after all. "If I said yes," she began, then stopped. "If I agreed to work for you, when would I start?" "Tonight, if you're willing. Like I said, the weather's closing in. We need to get back to the ranch before the roads become impossible. Tonight." The word hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. On one side lay Deadwood, with its uncertain opportunities and the constant threat of hunger. On the other lay the unknown, a ranch in a valley she'd never seen, with a man she'd known for 20 minutes. But as she sat in the smoky saloon, Listening to the wind howl outside and feeling the last warmth of her meal fade from her belly, Evangeline realized she'd already made her choice. Staying meant slow starvation or worse. Going meant risk but also hope. She met William McKenna's eyes across the table and saw her own desperation reflected there, mixed with something that might have been salvation. The wagon wheels crunched through fresh snow as William McKenna's horses pulled them away from Deadwood's flickering lights, and Evangeline Hayes clutched her small bundle of belongings while wondering if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The darkness around them felt alive, full of unseen dangers and the howling of wolves in the distance. "Cold?" William asked, noticing her shiver. "A little," she admitted, though the truth was she felt frozen to her bones. The thin coat she wore had been fine for Boston winters, but the Dakota Territory's bitter wind cut right through it like a knife through paper. Without a word, William reached behind the wagon seat and pulled out a thick woolen blanket. "Here. Can't have you catching your death before we even reach the ranch." The blanket smelled like horses and honest work, completely different from the perfumed silks she'd known in her former life. But it was warm, and warmth was more valuable than perfume when you were riding through a blizzard toward an uncertain future. "How much farther?" she asked, watching the snow swirl in the light of their lantern. "About an hour, maybe less if the horses keep this pace. They know they're heading home. They always move faster when they smell their own barn." Home. The word felt strange in her mouth. She hadn't had a real home since her father died. Just rooms she rented and places she stayed until the money ran out. Could a stranger's ranch become home to someone like her? The wagon hit a deep rut, bouncing them both hard against the wooden seat. Evangeline gasped as pain shot through her back, and William immediately slowed the horses. "Sorry about that. This road gets treacherous when it snows. The ruts fill up and you can't see where the bad spots are." "It's all right," she said, though her back still ached. "I suppose ranch life involves a lot of bumps and bruises." "Some. But there are good parts too. Wait until you see the sunrise over the valley in the morning. Catherine used to say it was like watching God paint the sky." There was that name again. Catherine. The woman whose shadow seemed to follow William everywhere he went. Evangeline wanted to ask more questions about his dead wife, but something in his voice warned her to wait. Some stories couldn't be rushed. "Tell me about the cattle," she said instead. William's face brightened, and she realized she'd chosen a safe topic. "I've got about 200 head right now, mostly Texas Longhorns. Hardy animals, good for this climate. They can find grass under a foot of snow and survive temperatures that would kill more delicate breeds." "Do you handle them all by yourself?" "I have 2 hands who help during roundup season, Charlie Murphy and his son Tom. Good men, both of them. Charlie's been working cattle since before I was born, and Tom's learning fast. But winter's the quiet time. The cattle mostly take care of themselves if you make sure they have access to water and shelter." As they talked, the snow began falling more heavily, turning the world into a white tunnel illuminated by their single lantern. The horses' breath came out in great puffs of steam, and ice began forming on their harnesses. "Are we going to make it?" Evangeline asked, fighting down a surge of panic. She'd heard too many stories of people freezing to death caught in blizzards on the frontier. "We'll make it," William said with quiet confidence. "These horses know the way better than I do. They could find the ranch blindfolded." Sure enough, just as her fingers were going numb despite the blanket, she saw a warm glow ahead. Not the scattered lights of a town, but the steady, welcoming light of windows in a house where someone was waiting. "There she is," William said, and she could hear the pride in his voice. Willow Creek Ranch. The house that emerged from the swirling snow looked like something from a dream. It was bigger than she'd expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that sent smoke curling up into the night sky. Light glowed from several windows, and she could see the dark shapes of outbuildings nearby, a barn, a chicken coop, and what looked like a workshop. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Catherine designed it," William said simply. "She said a house should look like it belonged to the land, not like it was fighting against it." He pulled the wagon up to the front porch, and immediately a dog came bounding out of the darkness. a medium-sized mutt with floppy ears and a tail that wagged so hard his whole body wiggled. "That's Rusty," William said with his first real smile of the evening. "Best cattle dog in the territory, and he thinks he owns the place." Rusty jumped up on the wagon, trying to lick both of them at once while whining with excitement at his master's return. "Down, boy," William laughed, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We've got company tonight. You be nice to Miss Hayes." Rusty immediately turned his attention to Evangeline, sniffing her carefully before apparently deciding she was acceptable. His approval felt like a small victory. William helped her down from the wagon, and she was surprised by the steadiness of his hands, the gentle way he made sure she found her footing on the snowy ground. Then he led her up the porch steps, Rusty dancing around their feet. "Welcome to your new home," he said, opening the front door. The warmth that greeted them was like stepping into an embrace. A fire crackled in a large stone fireplace, and oil lamps cast golden light on polished wooden floors and comfortable furniture. But what caught Evangeline's attention immediately was the piano in the corner, a beautiful upright with sheet music still sitting on the music stand. "She left it out," William said quietly, following her gaze. "The last song she was learning before she got sick. I never had the heart to put it away." Evangeline moved closer to read the title of the music. "For Elise," she whispered. "I know this piece." "Do you?" William's voice was carefully neutral, but she could hear the emotion underneath. Maybe someday you might play it." The request hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings she couldn't fully understand yet. This wasn't just about music. It was about healing, about bringing life back to a house that had been holding its breath for 2 years. "I'd like that," she said softly. William showed her through the rest of the house. A kitchen with a modern cook stove, a dining room with a table that could seat 8 people, and upstairs, several bedrooms including the small but comfortable room that would be hers. "The master bedroom is at the end of the hall," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I keep the door closed mostly. Old habits." Another mystery, another piece of the puzzle that was William McKenna's grief. Evangeline filed it away with all the other questions she was learning to save for later. "Your room is here," he continued, opening a door to reveal a cozy space with a single bed, a washstand, and a window that would face east toward the sunrise. "There are extra quilts in the chest if you get cold, and the kitchen's always warm if you need to come downstairs in the night." It was the nicest room she'd had since leaving Boston, clean and welcoming and completely her own. For a moment, she felt tears threaten, overwhelmed by the kindness of this near stranger who'd rescued her from slow starvation in Deadwood. "Thank you," she managed, "for all of this. I know you don't really know me, and taking in a stranger is a risk." William was quiet for a moment, looking out her window at the storm that raged beyond the glass. "We're all strangers until we choose not to be," he said finally. "And everyone deserves a chance to start over." As he left her alone to settle in, Evangeline sat on the edge of her new bed and listened to the sounds of the house around her. The wind against the windows, the settling of logs, the distant sound of William moving around downstairs. For the first time in months, she felt safe. But safety, she was learning, could be its own kind of danger. What happened when you got used to kindness? What happened when the person offering it decided they'd made a mistake? Outside, the storm showed no signs of stopping, and Evangeline realized she was completely cut off from the world she'd known. Whatever happened now, there would be no going back to Deadwood until spring. She was committed to this new life, whether it proved to be salvation or another kind of trap. Dawn broke over Willow Creek Valley like a golden promise, and Evangeline Hayes woke to the sound of chickens clucking and the distant lowing of cattle calling to each other across the snowy pastures. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The bed was too comfortable, the room too warm, the silence too peaceful. Then memory flooded back. The ranch. William McKenna. Her new life as a housekeeper to a widowed rancher who still talked to his dead wife's ghost. She dressed quickly in her warmest clothes and made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon toward the kitchen. William stood at the stove, already dressed for the day's work, turning strips of meat with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd been cooking for himself too long. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Hope you slept well. The storm passed about an hour ago." "I slept wonderfully, better than I have in months." She moved to the window and gasped at what she saw outside. The valley stretched away from the house like a picture from a fairy tale, covered in pristine white snow that sparkled in the morning sunlight. Cattle dotted the landscape like dark spots on a painter's canvas, and mountains rose in the distance, purple and magnificent against the clear blue sky. "It's absolutely beautiful," she breathed. Catherine always said the same thing. She loved winter mornings best, claimed they made everything look clean and new, like the world was starting over. There was that name again, spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for prayers. Evangeline turned from the window to study William's face, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly whenever he mentioned his wife. "How long were you married?" she asked gently. 5 years. Met her in Denver when I was buying breeding stock. She was working in a hotel restaurant, saving money to go back east to her family. His hands stilled on the bacon fork. "I convinced her to stay." "Do you regret it? Asking her to stay? I mean..." William was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Every day since she died. If she'd gone back east, she might still be alive. Better doctors there, better medicine." The pain in his voice was so raw it made Evangeline's chest ache. She wanted to comfort him somehow, but what could she say? That everything happened for a reason? That God had a plan? Those were the empty words people had offered when her own father died, and they'd brought no comfort at all. Instead, she said, "She chose to stay. That means something." "Does it?" William looked at her then, his eyes full of questions she couldn't answer. "Or does it just mean I was selfish enough to let her?" Before she could respond, a commotion outside made them both turn toward the window. A horse and rider were approaching fast, the animal's breath steaming in the cold air as it galloped through the snow. "That's Tom Murphy," William said, frowning. "Charlie's boy. Something must be wrong. They don't usually come up to the house unless there's trouble." Tom reined in his horse at the porch and called out, "Mr. McKenna, you need to come quick. We got cattle stuck in the creek bottom, and the ice is starting to break up." William was already reaching for his coat and hat. "How many head?" "About 30, maybe more. They went down for water yesterday before the storm hit, and now they're trapped. Pa says the ice won't hold much longer, and if it gives way, they'll all drown," William finished grimly. He turned to Evangeline. "I have to go. This is exactly the kind of emergency that can wipe out a ranch if you don't handle it fast. What can I do to help?" "Stay here, keep the fire going, and have hot coffee ready when we get back. We'll be cold and exhausted, and there might be injured cattle to tend." As he headed for the door, Evangeline caught his arm. "Be careful. I just found a safe place. I don't want to lose it because my employer got himself killed rescuing cows." William's expression softened slightly. "I'll be careful, but those cattle represent most of my investment in this ranch. Without them, there won't be a safe place for either of us." After he left, the house felt enormous and empty. Evangeline made herself busy exploring the kitchen, learning where everything was kept and marveling at the modern conveniences William had installed. The cook stove was better than anything she'd used in Boston, and the pantry was well stocked with supplies that would last through a long winter. She found flour and eggs and decided to make biscuits, something warm and filling for the men when they returned. Cooking had never been her strong suit, but how hard could biscuits be? Very hard, as it turned out. Her first batch came out of the oven looking like charcoal lumps, and her second attempt was raw in the middle. By the third try, she was fighting back tears of frustration. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, dumping another failed batch into the slop bucket for the pigs. "I can play Chopin, I can speak 3 languages, I can recite poetry for hours. Surely I can make simple biscuits." But the biscuits seemed determined to humble her, and by the time she heard horses returning outside, she had nothing to show for her efforts except a kitchen that looked like a flour bomb had exploded in it. William came through the door stamping snow off his boots, his face red with cold and exhaustion. Behind him came Charlie Murphy, an older man with white whiskers and kind eyes, and Tom, who looked ready to collapse. "Coffee's ready," Evangeline said quickly, trying to block their view of the messy kitchen. "And I attempted biscuits, but I'm afraid they're not edible." William took one look at the flour-covered counters and her embarrassed face, and to her surprise, he started laughing. Not cruel laughter, but the warm, genuine kind that made her feel less alone. "Don't worry about it," he said, hanging up his coat. "First rule of ranch cooking, if it doesn't work out, there's always bread and beans. Charlie, Tom, this is Miss Hayes, our new housekeeper." Charlie tipped his hat politely. "Pleasure, miss. Don't you worry about them biscuits. Took my wife 6 months to figure out the altitude does funny things to baking. You'll get the hang of it." As the men warmed themselves by the fire and told her about the cattle rescue, how they'd used ropes and horses to pull the trapped animals to safety, how close they'd come to losing the whole herd, Evangeline realized something important was happening. She was becoming part of their world, part of the small community that kept this ranch running. "We saved them all," William said with satisfaction. "Scared and cold, but alive. Tom here showed real courage today. Went out on the ice himself to get ropes around the last few." Tom blushed at the praise. "Just doing what needed doing, Mr. McKenna. Still took guts. Your pa should be proud." Charlie beamed at his son, and Evangeline felt a pang of longing. When had anyone last been proud of her? When had she last done something that mattered, something that helped other people? "Next time there's an emergency," she said impulsively, "I want to help, really help, not just stay here making coffee." William studied her face. "Ranch emergencies can be dangerous. Today we were dealing with breaking ice, spooked cattle, and temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. I'm stronger than I look. I don't doubt that, but strength isn't always enough. You need experience, knowledge of how cattle behave, understanding of the dangers. Then teach me," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I don't want to be just a housekeeper hiding in the kitchen while real work happens outside." Charlie and Tom exchanged glances, and she could see them wondering what kind of woman demanded to work with cattle. But William nodded slowly. "All right, when the weather clears, I'll start showing you around the ranch properly, teaching you how we do things here. And I'll teach you to make proper biscuits," Charlie added with a grin. "Can't have folks going hungry just because the altitude's got you confused." As the afternoon wore on and the men shared stories of other cattle rescues and ranch emergencies, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death. The sense of belonging somewhere, of being part of something larger than her own survival. But even as warmth and acceptance surrounded her like the heat from the fireplace, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too good to last. People like her, people with nothing to offer but desperation and willingness to work, didn't usually find safe harbors like Willow Creek Ranch. Something would go wrong eventually. Someone would discover that Evangeline Hayes was just a fraud playing at being useful, and when that happened, she'd be back on the road with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge that she'd briefly tasted something wonderful before losing it forever. But for now, with snow falling gently outside and the smell of real coffee filling the warm kitchen, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally found a place where she could build something lasting. The piano keys felt cold under Evangeline's fingers as she sat alone in the parlor, 3 weeks into her new life at Willow Creek Ranch, trying to remember the melody that had once brought her such joy. The sheet music for Fur Elise stared back at her from the stand, but every time she tried to play, the notes came out wrong, clumsy, like her hands had forgotten their purpose. "Just concentrate," she whispered to herself, positioning her fingers over the keys again. "You've played this 1,000 times before." But the music that emerged was hesitant and broken, nothing like the flowing melody Catherine McKenna had been learning before her death. Evangeline could feel the ghost of the other woman in this room, in the way William's eyes grew distant whenever he heard her playing, in the careful way he dusted the piano every morning but never moved the sheet music. She was getting better at ranch life. Her biscuits no longer resembled chunks of coal. She could gather eggs without getting pecked by the aggressive hens, and she'd even learned to milk the cow without getting kicked. But here, at Catherine's piano, she felt like an intruder pretending to belong. The front door opened with a bang, startling her so badly she hit a discordant cluster of notes. William came in stamping snow off his boots, his face grim with worry. "We've got trouble," he announced without preamble. "Charlie spotted tracks this morning, wolves, and a big pack from the look of it. They're getting desperate with all this snow, and desperate wolves do desperate things." Evangeline's stomach dropped. She'd heard the howling at night, growing closer and more frequent as winter deepened. Are the cattle in danger? The cattle, the horses, the chickens, anything they can bring down. And wolves that have lost their fear of humans. He shook his head. Well, they don't stay afraid of humans long. What do we do? William moved to a cabinet in the corner and pulled out a rifle, checking it with practiced movements. We protect what's ours. Charlie's bringing extra ammunition from town, and we'll take turns standing watch. But I need you to understand something, Evangeline. This isn't like the cattle emergency last week. Wolves are predators and they're smart. If they decide this ranch is their territory, people can get hurt. The seriousness in his voice made her hands tremble. You think they might attack the house? Probably not, but hunger makes animals unpredictable. I want you to stay inside after dark. Keep the doors locked. And if you hear anything unusual, you wake me immediately. No heroics. No trying to handle things yourself. Before she could respond, Charlie Murphy's voice called from outside. William, you need to see this. They rushed to the window and saw Charlie standing in the yard, pointing toward the pasture where the cattle were kept. Even from a distance, Evangeline could see dark shapes moving among the herd, shapes that definitely weren't cattle. They're hunting in broad daylight, William said, his voice tight with concern. That means they're either very hungry or very desperate. Neither one is good news for us. He grabbed his rifle and headed for the door, then stopped and looked back at Evangeline. Lock this door behind me, and don't open it for anyone except Charlie, Tom, or me. If someone else comes to the door, you pretend nobody's home. William, wait dash. But he was already gone, running toward the pasture where Charlie was firing warning shots to drive the wolves away from the cattle. Evangeline locked the door as instructed, then pressed her face to the window to watch the men work. The wolves were magnificent and terrifying, gray shapes that moved like flowing water across the snow, always staying just out of rifle range but never quite giving up their hunt. She counted at least 8 of them, maybe more, and the leader was enormous, with yellow eyes that seemed to glow even in the daylight. For 20 minutes, the men managed to keep the wolves at bay, firing shots that sent them retreating toward the tree line. But each time the shooting stopped, the pack crept closer again, testing the humans' resolve. Then disaster struck. One of the younger cattle, spooked by the gunfire and the smell of wolves, broke away from the herd and bolted toward the forest. The pack moved as one, flowing after the panicked animal like a gray tide. No! Evangeline gasped, watching helplessly as the calf disappeared into the trees with the wolves in pursuit. A few minutes later, the sounds that emerged from the forest made her cover her ears and turn away from the window. When William and Charlie returned to the house an hour later, their faces were grim. Lost the yearling, Charlie reported, accepting the hot coffee Evangeline offered with shaking hands. Nothing we could do once it bolted. Wolves took it down before we could even get close. It won't be the last, William said, staring out at the pasture where the remaining cattle huddled together nervously. Now that they've had success here, they'll be back. Tonight, tomorrow night, every night until we drive them off, or... He didn't finish the sentence. Or what? Evangeline asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Or until they decide the ranch isn't worth the fight and move on to easier prey. Charlie's weathered face was troubled. Problem is, there ain't much easier prey around these parts. Most of the wild game has moved south for the winter, and other ranches are having the same troubles we are. These wolves are going to keep pushing until something gives. That night, Evangeline lay in her bed listening to the men take turns walking guard duty around the house and barn. Every sound made her heart race. The wind rattling the windows, the settling of the house, the distant calls of the wolf pack that seemed to be circling closer with each passing hour. Around midnight, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Scratching at the kitchen door, soft but persistent, like someone or something was testing the lock. She crept to the top of the stairs and listened, hardly daring to breathe. The scratching continued for several minutes, then stopped. Silence stretched for what felt like hours before she heard William's voice from outside. "They're gone for now, but they'll be back. Tom, you take the next watch. Charlie, get some rest. We're going to need all our strength tomorrow." The next morning brought fresh wolf tracks in the snow around the house, confirming Evangeline's worst fears. The pack wasn't just hunting cattle anymore. They were studying the humans, learning their patterns, looking for weaknesses. "We can't keep this up forever," Charlie said over breakfast, his eyes red with exhaustion. "Need to either find a way to drive them off permanent-like, or abandon the ranch," William finished, the words seeming to cost him physical pain. "Pack up what we can carry and head to town until spring." "Would that work?" Evangeline asked. "For us, maybe. For the cattle and horses we'd have to leave behind." William's jaw tightened. Let's just say it wouldn't end well for them. The idea of leaving the ranch, this place that had become her sanctuary, filled Evangeline with desperate panic. Where would she go? What would she do? She had no money saved yet, no other options, no family to turn to. "There has to be another way," she said, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "Something we haven't thought of yet." Charlie and William exchanged glances, and she could see them wondering what a city woman could possibly know about dealing with wolves. But Tom Murphy, who had been quiet through most of the conversation, suddenly looked up from his eggs. "What about poison?" he asked. "My uncle up in Montana uses strychnine to deal with wolf problems. Sets out bait laced with enough poison to kill a whole pack." "Too dangerous," William said immediately. "Poison that strong could kill the cattle, the horses, even us if we're not careful. And it's not reliable. Wolves are smart enough to avoid bait if they smell something wrong." "Then what about trapping?" Evangeline suggested. "Could we set snares or something like that?" "Wolves are too clever for most traps, and the ones that might work are too expensive for a ranch this size," Charlie explained gently. "We're talking about animals that have been avoiding human tricks for thousands of years." As the conversation continued, with each possible solution revealing new problems, Evangeline felt a familiar despair settling over her. Just when she'd found a place to belong, forces beyond her control were threatening to take it away. But this time, she realized, she wasn't going to give up without a fight. This ranch, this life, these people, they were worth fighting for, even if she didn't know how to fight yet. Fire exploded across the eastern pasture like an orange demon dancing against the night sky, and Evangeline ran from the house clutching a bucket of water while William and Charlie shouted orders that were lost in the roar of flames and panicked cattle. The wolf pack had struck again, but this time they'd knocked over a kerosene lantern in the barn, and now everything was burning. "The horses!" William bellowed, pointing toward the barn where terrified whinnying could be heard above the crackling of flames. "Get the horses out first." Tom Murphy was already at the barn doors, struggling to open them against the press of smoke-panicked animals inside. Evangeline reached him first, adding her strength to his as they fought to swing the heavy doors wide. "Stand back," Charlie warned as the first horse burst through the opening, a wild-eyed mare with singed hair and terror in her eyes. Behind her came the others, a stampede of hooves and steam and desperate flight that nearly trampled anyone in their path. William counted quickly as the animals scattered across the yard. "That's all of them. Now the cattle." But the cattle were a different problem entirely. Spooked by fire and wolves and the smell of their own fear, the herd had bunched together at the far end of the burning pasture, trapped between flames on one side and the wolf pack on the other. Every time the men tried to drive them toward safety, the wolves would show themselves, and the cattle would surge back toward the fire. "This is impossible," Tom shouted, his face black with soot. "We can't fight the fire and the wolves at the same time." Evangeline looked around desperately, trying to see some solution the men had missed. The fire was spreading faster than they could contain it, fed by dry winter grass and the wooden fence posts that surrounded the pasture. Soon it would reach the main barn, and then the house itself would be in danger. That's when she saw it, Catherine's piano, visible through the parlor window, the sheet music still sitting on the stand where she'd left it that morning. The piano that had been Catherine's pride and joy, the music that William couldn't bear to hear played badly. An idea struck her, crazy and desperate but possibly their only chance. "The piano," she called to William. "I need to get to the piano." "Are you insane?" he shouted back. "The house could catch fire any minute. Trust me." She was already running toward the porch, dodging sparks that fell like burning snow. "Just give me 5 minutes." Inside the house, smoke was beginning to seep through the windows, but the parlor was still clear. Evangeline sat at the piano bench, positioned her fingers over the keys, and began to play. Not Fur Elise. That delicate melody would be lost in the chaos outside. Instead, she played something she'd learned as a child in Boston, something her music teacher had called warrior music. Bold, commanding notes that carried power and authority. First, nothing happened. The fire continued to rage, the cattle continued to panic, and the men continued their desperate battle against impossible odds. But slowly, gradually, something began to change. The cattle were listening. Music had power over animals. Every ranch hand knew that. Cowboys sang to cattle during long drives to keep them calm, and many ranchers used bells or horns to call their herds. But Evangeline was doing something different, something that reached deeper than simple sound. She was calling to them with pure emotion, with the same desperate determination that had kept her alive through months of hunger and uncertainty. The music poured out of her like a prayer, like a command, like a promise that safety was possible if they would just listen and follow. One by one, the cattle began to move away from the fire, drawn by the sound that seemed to offer refuge from their terror. They moved slowly at first, then with growing confidence as the music continued to flow from the house. Outside, William saw what was happening and shouted to Charlie and Tom, "Drive them toward the house. She's calling them in." Working together, the men guided the cattle away from the flames and the wolves, using Evangeline's music as a beacon to lead the frightened animals to safety. It took nearly an hour, but eventually the entire herd was gathered in the yard near the house, still nervous but no longer panicked. The wolves, frustrated and confused by this turn of events, melted back into the forest to wait for a better opportunity. Only then did the men turn their full attention to fighting the fire. With buckets and shovels and sheer determination, they managed to contain the blaze before it reached the main barn. By dawn, the immediate crisis was over, though the eastern pasture was a blackened wasteland that would take years to recover. "How did you know?" William asked as they sat exhausted on the porch, watching the sun rise over the damaged ranch. "About the music, I mean. How did you know it would work?" Evangeline looked at her hands, still trembling from the hours of playing. "I didn't know. I remembered something my father told me once, about how music could touch the wild part of any creature. I thought maybe, if I could reach that part of the cattle, I could give them something to follow besides their fear." Charlie shook his head in amazement. "In 30 years of working cattle, I've never seen anything like it. Those animals followed your music like it was a rope pulling them to safety." "Catherine would have been proud," William said quietly, and Evangeline felt her heart skip at the words. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife in connection with something positive, something hopeful. "The wolves will be back," Tom pointed out, ever practical. "We bought ourselves some time, but we haven't solved the real problem." "Maybe we have," William said, looking at Evangeline with something like wonder in his eyes. "If music can calm cattle in a crisis, maybe it can do other things too. Maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong." "What do you mean?" Evangeline asked. "I mean, maybe we don't need to fight the wolves directly. Maybe we just need to make sure our animals don't act like prey when the wolves come hunting." It was a radical idea, using music as a weapon against wild predators. But as they sat in the growing daylight, surrounded by the cattle that had trusted Evangeline's melody enough to walk away from fire and wolves, it began to seem not just possible, but inevitable. "We'll need to practice," William continued, his mind already working through the possibilities. Figure out what kinds of music work best, what times of day the cattle are most responsive. And we'll need a way to make the music carry farther, so it can reach animals that are scattered across the whole ranch. I could build something, Charlie offered. A kind of horn or trumpet that would make the piano music louder. My grandfather was a blacksmith. I know a bit about working metal. As they talked and planned, Evangeline felt something she'd never experienced before. The sensation of being truly essential to something important. Not just helpful, not just useful, but absolutely necessary to the success of their shared endeavor. For the first time since arriving at Willow Creek Ranch, she wasn't Catherine's replacement or William's charity case. She was Evangeline McKenna, the woman whose music had saved the ranch from destruction, whose courage had found a solution where none had existed before. The thought stopped her cold. When had she started thinking of herself as Evangeline McKenna? When had William's last name become part of her identity? She looked at him, still talking animatedly with Charlie about musical cattle management, and realized that somewhere between the flower-covered kitchen disasters and the midnight wolf watches, something fundamental had changed between them. He wasn't just her employer anymore, and she wasn't just his housekeeper. They were partners, bound together by shared danger and mutual respect and something else she didn't quite dare to name. The question was, did William feel it too? Or was she just projecting her own growing feelings onto a man who was still mourning his true love? As if sensing her thoughts, William looked up and caught her eye. For a moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition, a possibility that made her heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. Then Tom Murphy stood up and stretched, breaking the spell. Well, if we're going to turn this place into some kind of musical ranch, we'd better get started. Those wolves won't stay discouraged forever. But as they all rose to begin another day of hard work and impossible dreams, Evangeline carried with her the memory of that look in William's eyes, and the growing certainty that everything was about to change in ways none of them could predict. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, carried by a half-frozen postal rider who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than the Dakota Territory. And the moment Evangeline saw the fancy handwriting on the envelope, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. Mail for Miss Evangeline Hayes, the rider announced, stamping snow off his boots on the porch. Had a devil of a time finding this place. Most folks in Deadwood said there wasn't no Miss Hayes living out this way. William took the letter with a puzzled expression, glancing at the return address. Boston, he read aloud. From someone called Cornelius Ashford, attorney at law. Evangeline's hands began to shake as she recognized the name. Ashford had been one of her father's creditors, a man with cold eyes and colder heart who'd made it clear that the Hayes family debts wouldn't die with Randolph Hayes. I'll take that, she said quickly, reaching for the envelope. But William had already noticed her reaction. You know this person? It's probably nothing important. Just someone from my old life. The postal rider cleared his throat impatiently. If you don't mind, I've got 6 more deliveries before dark, and this weather ain't getting any friendlier. After the rider left, Evangeline found herself alone in the kitchen with the letter, too afraid to open it but too afraid not to. William had gone to check on the cattle, giving her privacy she wasn't sure she wanted. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the expensive paper inside. Miss Hayes, your debts to the estate of Randolph Hayes have not been forgotten, despite your disappearance from civilized society. Recent inquiries have revealed your current location, and I am prepared to offer you one final opportunity to settle these obligations without involving the territorial authorities. The total amount owed, including accumulated interest and collection fees, now stands at $843. This sum must be paid in full within 30 days of receipt of this notice, or legal action will be taken to recover the debt through seizure of assets and, if necessary, your return to Boston for trial. I trust you will see the wisdom of cooperation in this matter. Cornelius Ashford, Esq. $800. The amount might as well have been $8,000 for all the chance she had of paying it. Even with her wages from William, it would take her 2 years to save that much money, and Ashford clearly wasn't willing to wait. Bad news, She spun around to find William standing in the doorway, concern written across his weather-beaten face. In her panic, she hadn't heard him return from the pasture. She couldn't find words to explain the disaster that was about to destroy everything she'd built here. William crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and gently took the letter from her nerveless fingers. She wanted to stop him, to snatch it back and pretend it had never arrived. But what was the point? He'd find out eventually. She watched his face change as he read, saw his jaw tighten and his eyes grow hard with anger. $800, he said finally. For debts your father accumulated before he died. I co-signed the papers, Evangeline admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was helping him maintain his dignity during his final illness. I didn't understand what it meant. And this Ashford character thinks he can just demand payment from a woman trying to make an honest living on the frontier? He can do more than demand it. He has legal authority to have me arrested and taken back to Boston if I can't pay. William was quiet for a long moment, staring at the letter like he could make it disappear through sheer force of will. Then he said, How long do we have? 30 days from when I received the letter. So basically a month. A month. William folded the letter carefully and set it on the kitchen table. Well, then we'd better figure out what we're going to do about it. The casual way he said we made Evangeline's heart skip, but she forced herself to be realistic. There's no we about this, William. It's my debt, my problem. I won't let it destroy your ranch. And I won't let some fancy Boston lawyer destroy the best thing that's happened to this place in 2 years. Before she could ask what he meant by that, the sound of approaching horses made them both look toward the window. 3 riders were coming up the valley road, moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. More trouble? Evangeline asked, her stomach already clenched with dread. William squinted at the approaching figures. I don't recognize them, but anyone riding that hard in this weather is either running from something or toward something, and neither one is usually good news for the people they visit. The riders pulled up at the porch in a cloud of steam and snow. The leader was a thin man in an expensive coat that marked him as distinctly out of place on the frontier. Behind him rode 2 rough-looking companions whose hands rested casually near their gun belts. Mr. William McKenna? The thin man called out. I'm Cornelius Ashford, attorney for certain creditors in Boston. I believe you have something that belongs to my clients. Evangeline felt the bottom drop out of her world. Ashford hadn't waited 30 days. He'd come to collect immediately, bringing hired guns to ensure compliance. That was fast, William said grimly. Letter only arrived this morning. I sent the letter as a courtesy, Ashford replied, dismounting with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to horses. But time is money, Mr. McKenna, and my clients have been patient long enough. Your client's quarrel is with Miss Hayes, not with me. Ah, but Miss Hayes is your employee, living on your property under your protection. That makes you involved whether you choose to be or not. One of Ashford's companions, a large man with cruel eyes and scarred knuckles, leaned forward in his saddle. Pretty isolated place you got here, McKenna. Long way from town. Long way from help if something unfortunate was to happen. The threat was unmistakable, and Evangeline saw William's hand move instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against the porch post. Are you threatening me on my own land? William's voice was deadly quiet. Not threatening, Ashford said smoothly. Simply pointing out the realities of your situation. Miss Hayes owes a substantial debt to legitimate creditors. That debt can be satisfied with money, or it can be satisfied by other means. The choice is yours. What other means? Evangeline asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. Miss Hayes returns to Boston with us to work off what's owed. There are establishments there that specialize in providing employment for young women in debt. Not pleasant work, perhaps, but it pays well and ensures the creditors receive their due. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what Ashford was really describing, and Evangeline felt sick to her stomach. She'd heard whispers about such places in Boston. Establishments where desperate women worked in conditions little better than slavery to pay off impossible debts. Over my dead body, William said, his hand now openly gripping the rifle. That can be arranged, the scarred man replied with an ugly smile. The tension in the yard stretched taut as a bowstring, and Evangeline realized they were moments away from violence that would end with someone dead in the snow. She stepped forward, placing herself between William and Ashford's guns. Wait, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. There has to be another way to settle this. Some kind of payment plan or additional time to raise the money. Ashford's smile was cold as the winter wind. I'm afraid not, Miss Hayes. My clients have been quite specific: full payment immediately, or you return with us to Boston. Those are the only options. Like hell they are, William growled. But before anyone could draw a weapon, the sound of more horses approaching made them all turn. Charlie Murphy and his son Tom were riding hard toward the ranch house, and behind them came at least a dozen other men, ranchers and townspeople from Deadwood and the surrounding area. Looks like the cavalry's arrived, Tom called out as they reined in their horses. Got word there might be trouble out here. Ashford's confident expression wavered slightly as he found himself outnumbered 4-1 by armed frontiersmen, who clearly weren't impressed by his legal authority or his hired guns. This is a private matter, he said, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. Nothing's private when it involves our neighbors, Charlie replied firmly. Miss Hayes has been good to folks around here. Helped birth Mary Kendrick's baby, played music at church socials, never asked for anything she didn't earn honest. If you got business with her, you got business with all of us. The standoff continued for several more tense minutes, but Ashford was smart enough to recognize when the odds had turned against him. Very well, he said finally. But this matter isn't settled. Miss Hayes still owes a legal debt, and it will be collected one way or another. As the three men rode away, disappearing into the swirling snow like evil spirits returning to whatever hell had spawned them, Evangeline felt a mixture of relief and despair. The immediate threat was gone, but the underlying problem remained. She still owed $800 she didn't have, and men like Ashford didn't give up easily. They'd be back, probably with more hired guns and less patience for negotiation. Thank you, she said to the assembled men. All of you. I don't know how to repay such kindness. Don't need repaying, one of the ranchers replied. Just being neighborly. But Miss Hayes, you might want to think about finding a more permanent solution to this problem. Men like that lawyer don't stay discouraged long. As the crowd dispersed and quiet returned to the ranch, William and Evangeline found themselves alone with the weight of their uncertain future pressing down like the gathering storm clouds. $800, William said again, as if saying it enough times might make it seem less impossible. I'll leave, Evangeline said suddenly. Tonight, if necessary. I'll disappear somewhere Ashford can't find me, and you won't be dragged into this mess. No. William's response was immediate and absolute. You're not running, and you're not facing this alone. We'll find another way. What other way? I don't have the money, you don't have the money, and Ashford isn't going to accept payment in cattle or good intentions. William was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered valley that had become their shared home. Then he said something that changed everything. There is one way, one solution that would solve all our problems and give Ashford no legal grounds to pursue you further. What's that? William turned to face her, his eyes full of hope and fear and desperate determination. Marry me. The silence that followed William's proposal stretched between them like a frozen river that neither dared to cross, and Evangeline felt her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it echoing in the sudden quiet of the kitchen. Marry you? She whispered, the words feeling strange and wonderful and terrifying in her mouth. Think about it, William said, his voice urgent with the kind of desperation that came from a man who'd found his solution and was afraid it might slip away. A wife's debts become her husband's responsibility under territorial law. If we're legally married, Ashford can't touch you without going through me first. Evangeline's mind raced through the implications. But that would make the debt your burden. $800, William. That's more than most people see in 5 years. Money can be earned again, he said, echoing words he'd spoken before. But finding someone who... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that wouldn't come. Someone who what? William looked out the window at the snow-covered valley, his hands clenched at his sides. Someone who makes this place feel like home again. Someone who plays music that chases away the ghosts. Someone who fights fire with piano melodies and sees solutions where other people see only problems. The raw honesty in his voice made tears spring to Evangeline's eyes. You're talking about Catherine. No. William turned back to her, his gaze direct and unwavering. I'm talking about you. Catherine was my past, Evangeline. These last few months, watching you bring life back to this ranch, watching you become part of everything we've built here, I've realized that you're my future, if you'll have me. Before she could respond, a commotion outside made them both freeze. Voices in the yard, horses snorting and stamping, the sound of men moving with purpose. They're back, Evangeline breathed, recognizing Ashford's commanding tone even through the closed door. With more men this time, William added grimly, peering through the curtain. Looks like he brought half of Deadwood's hired guns with him. A heavy knock rattled the front door, followed by Ashford's voice. Mr. McKenna. Miss Hayes, I know you're in there. Open this door, or my associates will open it for you. William grabbed his rifle from the corner and checked the ammunition with swift, practiced movements. The back door leads to the root cellar. You can hide there until dash. No. Evangeline straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin with a determination that surprised them both. I'm done hiding, done running. If Ashford wants to settle this, we'll settle it here and now. Evangeline, these men are dangerous. They've got guns and no scruples about using them. Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance. She moved toward the front door, but William caught her arm. Wait, before we face whatever's out there, I need to know. My proposal, was it just a legal solution to you, or? The question hung between them, loaded with months of unspoken feelings and carefully guarded hopes. Evangeline looked into his eyes and saw not just the rancher who'd offered her sanctuary, but the man who'd shown her that her worth wasn't measured by what she'd lost, but by what she chose to build. William McKenna, she said softly, I would be honored to be your wife. For legal reasons, yes, but also because somewhere between the burned biscuits and the wolf attacks, I fell in love with you. Relief and joy flooded his features, transforming his weather-beaten face into something almost boyish. Then whatever happens next, we face it together, as husband and wife. The pounding on the door grew more insistent, accompanied now by threats and curses that made it clear Ashford's patience had run out entirely. Mr. McKenna. Ashford's voice carried the edge of a man pushed beyond his limits. I have a court order authorizing the seizure of Miss Hayes for debt collection. Open this door immediately, or I'll have my men break it down. Court order from where? William called back. Last I checked, Boston courts don't have jurisdiction in the Dakota Territory. Federal court in Chicago. The debt crosses state lines, which makes it a federal matter. Evangeline felt her brief moment of hope crumble. A federal court order was different from Boston legal threats. It carried real authority out here on the frontier. Is there really a federal court order? She whispered to William. Maybe. Or maybe it's a bluff. Either way, we're not giving up without a fight. William moved to the window and called out, You want to discuss this legally, Ashford? Then let's do it properly. I'll meet you in town tomorrow morning, in front of the territorial judge. We'll sort this out through proper channels. I'm done with delays and negotiations, Ashford shouted back. You have 30 seconds to produce Miss Hayes, or my men will come in and get her. The threat was followed by the unmistakable sound of gun hammers being pulled back. Ashford had brought enough firepower to take the ranch by force, and he was clearly prepared to use it. 20 seconds, Ashford called. William and Evangeline looked at each other, both understanding that they'd reached the moment when words would no longer solve their problems. Whatever happened next would be decided by courage, luck, and the willingness to fight for what mattered most. Remember what I said about the root cellar, William murmured, positioning himself by the front window with his rifle ready. And remember what I said about facing this together, Evangeline replied, moving to the kitchen where she'd spotted a shotgun hanging over the door. 10 seconds. That's when the miracle happened. Not a divine intervention or a cavalry charge, but something far more practical and infinitely more welcome. The sound of Charlie Murphy's voice cutting through the winter air like a sword through silk. Ashford, you and your boys need to rethink what you're doing here. Through the window, they could see Charlie riding into the yard at the head of what looked like half the territory's population. Ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, even the local preacher, armed men who decided that legal technicalities mattered less than protecting their neighbors. This is a federal matter, Ashford protested, but his voice had lost its commanding confidence. You people have no authority to interfere. Maybe not, called Doc Patterson from horseback, but we've got something better than authority. We've got numbers, and we've got the right to defend folks who've earned our respect. Miss Hayes has been good to this community, added Mary Kendrick, who'd ridden out despite having given birth only months earlier. She helped save my baby's life, and I'll be damned if I let some fancy lawyer drag her off to pay her dead father's debts. The crowd murmured agreement, and Evangeline felt tears spring to her eyes as she realized the extent of the community that had formed around her without her even noticing. These people barely knew her real story, but they'd seen her work, witnessed her character, and decided she was worth defending. Furthermore, Doc Patterson continued, I've been authorized by the territorial government to inform you that any attempt to remove Miss Hayes from this jurisdiction without proper territorial court approval will be considered kidnapping under territorial law. You can't supersede federal authority. Ashford sputtered. Maybe not, but we can sure make it expensive and time-consuming for you to try. Are you prepared for a legal battle that could take years and cost more than the original debt? For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ashford looked uncertain. He'd come expecting to overwhelm a lone rancher and a desperate woman, not to face down an entire community backed by territorial law. The standoff continued for several more tense minutes before one of Ashford's hired guns leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Whatever the man said made Ashford's face go pale. This isn't over, he announced finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Hayes still owes a legal debt, and it will be collected. Maybe, Charlie replied calmly, but it won't be collected today, and it won't be collected by force. You boys might want to ride back to town before this weather gets worse. As Ashford and his men retreated once again, Evangeline sagged against the kitchen wall with relief and exhaustion. They'd won another reprieve, but the underlying problem remained unsolved. How long can this go on? She asked William as the crowd in their yard began to disperse. How many times can these good people risk themselves for my sake? As many times as it takes, William replied firmly. But you're right, we need a permanent solution. The marriage proposal, she said. Would that really solve everything legally? It would transfer your debts to me, which would at least give us time to figure out payment. But Evangeline, I don't want you to marry me just to escape Ashford. I want you to marry me because you want to build a life together. She looked around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary, thought about the music that flowed from Catherine's piano under her fingers, remembered the cattle following her melody away from fire and wolves. This place, this life, this man. They'd become more precious to her than anything she'd ever owned in Boston. I do want that, she said simply. More than I've ever wanted anything. But are you sure this is what you want? Are you ready to let Catherine's memory rest and build something new? William was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the parlor where the piano waited in the afternoon light. Then he said, Catherine would want me to be happy, and you, Evangeline Hayes, make me happier than I ever thought I'd be again. As evening fell over Willow Creek Ranch and the community that had rallied to protect them settled in for another cold winter night, Evangeline felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, facing exactly the challenges they were meant to face together. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new threats, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, in the warm kitchen of the ranch that had become her home, she was surrounded by love and support and the promise of a future worth fighting for. Blood dripped from Charlie Murphy's forehead onto the snow as he stumbled into the ranch house kitchen at dawn. his face pale and his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, while behind him Tom supported his weight and tried to explain what had happened through chattering teeth and barely controlled panic. "They came in the night," Tom gasped, helping his father to a chair while Evangeline rushed to get clean cloths and hot water. "6 of them, maybe more. Burned our barn, scattered our cattle. And when Pa tried to stop them, Ashford's men," William asked grimly, examining Charlie's injuries with gentle but experienced hands. "Had to be," Charlie wheezed, wincing as William probed his shoulder. "The leader, big fellow with scars on his knuckles. Same one we saw yesterday." They didn't say much, just made it clear this was a message. Evangeline pressed a damp cloth to the gash on Charlie's head, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "What kind of message?" "That anyone who helps you will pay the price," Tom said bitterly. "They made sure to mention your name specifically, Miss Hayes. Said folks around here needed to learn the cost of interfering with legal business." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows. Not only was Ashford still pursuing her, but now he was targeting innocent people, good families who'd done nothing but show her kindness. The thought that Charlie had been hurt because of her debts made her stomach churn with guilt and rage. "We need to get you to Doc Patterson," William said, fashioning a sling for Charlie's arm from a kitchen towel. "That shoulder's dislocated, and you might have a concussion from that head wound." "Can't afford to leave the ranch undefended," Charlie protested. "If they hit my place, yours could be next." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching riders made them all freeze. But instead of Ashford's hired guns, it was Mary Kendrick on horseback, riding fast despite the early hour and dangerous conditions. "William!" she called before her horse had fully stopped. "Thank God you're all right." They hit the Patterson place, 2 broke windows, killed chickens, left a note saying anyone who helped the Hayes woman would get worse. Evangeline felt the room spin around her. "Doc Patterson? Is he hurt?" "Shaken up but alive. Same with the preacher and the Andersons. They're hitting everyone who stood with you yesterday, trying to isolate you by scaring off your friends." The strategy was simple and effective. By targeting her supporters, Ashford was ensuring that the community would think twice before rallying to her defense again. Soon she'd be alone and vulnerable, with no one willing to risk their families for a stranger's problems. "This has to stop," Evangeline said, surprising everyone with the steel in her voice. "I won't let innocent people suffer because of my father's debts." "What are you thinking?" William asked, though something in her expression made him look worried. "I'm thinking it's time to end this, once and for all." Before anyone could stop her, Evangeline walked to the kitchen table where Ashford's letter still lay and picked up a pencil. In clear, decisive handwriting, she began to compose a response. "Mr. Ashford, your attacks on innocent families end now. If you want to settle this debt, meet me in Deadwood tomorrow at noon. Come alone and we'll discuss terms like civilized people. Continue terrorizing my neighbors, and you'll find me far less cooperative than you expect. Hayes." "Evangeline, no," William said, reading over her shoulder. "It's obviously a trap. He's trying to isolate you so he can take you back to Boston without interference. Maybe, but I can't let this war continue when good people are getting hurt." She folded the letter and sealed it with wax from a candle. "Tom, can you make sure this gets to Ashford today?" Tom looked uncertainly between Evangeline and William. "Miss Hayes, with respect, this seems like a terrible idea." "All my ideas seem terrible until they work," she replied with a weak smile. "Besides, I won't be going alone." "Damn right you won't," William said. "If you're determined to walk into Ashford's trap, I'm walking with you." "No." Evangeline's response was immediate and firm. "If something happens to me, the ranch needs someone to run it. Charlie and Tom need jobs, the cattle need care, and the community needs to know that standing up to bullies like Ashford doesn't end in disaster for everyone." The argument that followed was heated but brief. Evangeline had made up her mind, and nothing William said could shake her determination to face Ashford on her own terms. As Tom rode off to deliver the letter, Charlie spoke up from his chair by the fire. "You know what you're doing, Miss Hayes?" "Not really," she admitted. "But I know what I'm not doing." I'm not running anymore, and I'm not letting other people pay for my problems. The rest of the day passed in tense preparation. William cleaned and loaded every weapon on the ranch, despite Evangeline's insistence that she was going to meet Ashford alone. Charlie, despite his injuries, worked with Tom to secure the cattle and buildings against possible attack. Meanwhile, Evangeline spent hours at Catherine's piano, playing music that seemed to flow from somewhere deep inside her soul. The melodies weren't Catherine's careful practice pieces or the popular songs she'd learned in Boston. They were something entirely new, music born from struggle and hope and the determination to create something beautiful from the broken pieces of a shattered life. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," William said, appearing in the parlor doorway as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. "It's what this place sounds like to me," Evangeline replied, her fingers finding complex harmonies that seemed to capture the essence of wind across prairie grass and the distant calls of cattle settling for the night. "What it feels like to finally belong somewhere." William moved to stand beside the piano, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You know I can't let you face Ashford alone tomorrow. You know I can't let you risk everything you've built here for my sake." They'd been having variations of this argument all day, neither willing to give ground on what they saw as their responsibility to the other. But now, in the peaceful quiet of the parlor with music filling the space between them, something shifted. "There's something I need to tell you," William said quietly. "About the money. About what I'm willing to risk for you." Evangeline's hands stilled on the keys. "What do you mean?" "I mean I love you, Evangeline Hayes. Not as a replacement for Catherine, not as a solution to loneliness, but as the woman who brought music and laughter and hope back to this place when I thought they were gone forever." The words hung in the air like notes from the piano, beautiful and fragile and absolutely true. Evangeline turned on the bench to face him, seeing in his eyes the same mixture of love and fear that filled her own heart. "I love you too," she whispered, "more than I thought possible. But William, if something happens to me tomorrow, nothing's going to happen to you, because you're not going alone, and because we're going to find a way to end this that doesn't involve you sacrificing yourself for everyone else's safety." "What are you thinking?" William's smile was grim but determined. "I'm thinking it's time to fight fire with fire. Ashford wants to play dirty? Then we'll show him what frontier justice really looks like." As night fell over Willow Creek Ranch and the community that had become her chosen family settled in for what might be their last peaceful evening, Evangeline felt a strange mixture of terror and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation with her past, the ultimate test of everything she'd built in her new life. But tonight, with William's hand warm on her shoulder and music flowing from her fingertips like a prayer, she allowed herself to believe that love and determination might be enough to overcome even the most determined enemies. The piano sang its complex melodies into the darkness, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of everyone who'd found sanctuary in this remote valley. And somewhere in those notes was the promise that no matter what tomorrow brought, the music would continue, the love would endure, and the life they'd built together would survive whatever storms lay ahead. As the last notes faded into silence, Evangeline and William sat together in the lamplit parlor, holding hands and holding on to hope, preparing to face whatever final test awaited them in the morning light. The main street of Deadwood stretched before them like a stage set for the final act of a play, with snow-covered buildings forming the backdrop and nervous townspeople peering from windows and doorways, while Evangeline McKenna, she'd insisted on using the name even before the ceremony, walked steadily toward her appointment with destiny, her hand steady on the small pistol hidden in her coat pocket. "He's not here," William observed, scanning the street for signs of Ashford or his hired guns. Maybe he decided the odds weren't in his favor after all. But even as he spoke, a figure emerged from the Silver Dollar Saloon. Not Ashford, but Doc Patterson, moving quickly toward them with urgent purpose. "Thank God you're here," Doc said breathlessly. "We need to talk before Ashford shows up. There's something you need to know about that debt." "What kind of something?" Evangeline asked, though her heart was already racing with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a solution she hadn't considered. "I got curious about Ashford's legal authority, so I sent a telegram to a lawyer friend of mine in Chicago." Asked him to look into the case, verify the court orders and such. Doc pulled a crumpled telegram from his coat pocket and handed it to Evangeline with shaking hands. Turns out your Mr. Ashford has been playing fast and loose with the truth. Evangeline unfolded the telegram and read aloud. No federal court order exists for Hayes' debt collection. Ashford disbarred from practicing law in Illinois for fraud. Suggest immediate contact with territorial authorities. Signed, J. Morrison, attorney. The words seemed to dance on the paper as their meaning sank in. He's not even a real lawyer? Oh, he's a real lawyer, just not a licensed one anymore. And those court orders he's been waving around? Complete fabrications. The man's a confidence artist, pure and simple. William let out a bark of laughter that held no humor. So we've been running from a fraud this whole time? Gets better, Doc continued grimly. Those debts your father signed? According to my friend's research, most of them were paid off before your father died. Ashford's been collecting money that was never owed in the first place. Evangeline felt the world tilt around her as months of fear and desperation suddenly transformed into white-hot rage. He's been terrorizing people, burning barns, hurting families, all for money that wasn't even legally owed? That's about the size of it. Question now is, what do we do about it? Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses announced Ashford's arrival. But instead of the small group they'd expected, he'd brought at least a dozen men, rough-looking individuals who clearly weren't bound by any legal constraints. Looks like he's decided to abandon all pretense of legality, William muttered, his hand moving to his gun belt. Ashford dismounted with theatrical flair, clearly enjoying what he believed would be his moment of triumph. Behind him, his hired guns spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any escape routes from the main street. Miss Hayes, Ashford called out in his oily, commanding voice. I trust you've come to your senses about settling this debt. My patience has reached its absolute limit. Oh, I've definitely come to my senses, Evangeline replied, stepping forward with a confidence that surprised even herself. The question is whether you have. Something in her tone made Ashford's smile falter slightly. I'm not here for games, Miss Hayes. You owe money, and it will be collected one way or another. Actually, Doc Patterson interrupted, producing the telegram with a flourish. She doesn't owe anything at all. Turns out you're not who you claim to be, Mr. Ashford, if that's even your real name. The color drained from Ashford's face as Doc read the telegram aloud for everyone to hear. Around the street, townspeople began emerging from their hiding places, drawn by the revelation that their community had been terrorized by a common criminal. That's a forgery, Ashford stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. A desperate attempt to avoid legitimate debts. Easy enough to verify, called out Sheriff Jenkins, who'd been watching from the jailhouse doorway. Got my own telegram right here from the federal marshal's office. Seems there's quite a reward posted for a man matching your description, wanted for fraud, extortion, and impersonating a federal officer. The net was closing around Ashford, but cornered animals were often the most dangerous. His hand moved toward his gun, and his hired men tensed for action. Nobody moves, Ashford shouted, drawing his pistol and pointing it directly at Evangeline. I don't care what your telegrams say. I've got 12 guns and a willingness to use them. Miss Hayes is coming with me, and anyone who tries to stop that will end up dead in the snow. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with weapons drawn on both sides and death hovering over the frozen street like a carrion bird. Evangeline found herself thinking about the piano back at the ranch, about the music she might never play again, about the life she and William were just beginning to build together. Then she remembered something Charlie had taught her about handling frightened cattle. Sometimes the only way to calm a dangerous situation was to move toward it instead of away from it. You're right, she said, taking a step toward Ashford and his gun. I do owe a debt, but not money, and not to you. What are you talking about? Ashford demanded, but his gun hand was starting to shake. I owe a debt to every person you've hurt in your quest for money that was never yours. I owe a debt to this community that welcomed me and protected me. And I owe a debt to myself, to finally stop running from bullies and frauds who think they can steal other people's happiness. With each word, she took another step closer, and Ashford's composure crumbled a little more. "Stay back. I'll shoot." "No, you won't," Evangeline said with absolute certainty. "Because shooting me doesn't get you what you want. It just makes you a murderer in front of dozens of witnesses." She was close enough now to see the fear in Ashford's eyes, close enough to understand that underneath all his bluster and threats, he was just another desperate person trying to survive by taking what didn't belong to him. "The game's over," she said gently. "You lost the moment you decided to terrorize innocent families. Now you can either surrender to the sheriff like a civilized person, or you can run and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder for federal marshals." For a moment that stretched like eternity, Ashford stood frozen with his gun pointed at the woman who'd just stripped away all his lies and pretenses. Then his shoulders sagged, his gun hand dropped, and the fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. "I was so close," he whispered. "So close to having enough money to start over somewhere new." "There's always somewhere new," Evangeline said softly. "But you can't build a new life on other people's pain." As Sheriff Jenkins stepped forward to arrest Ashford and his men, the crowd that had gathered began to cheer. Not just for the end of a threat, but for the courage of a woman who'd faced down her demons and won. William reached Evangeline's side as the excitement died down, his face full of pride and love and amazement. "That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen." "Probably both," she admitted, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking with delayed reaction. "But I couldn't spend the rest of my life being afraid of frauds and bullies." "So what happens now?" Doc Patterson asked. "With Ashford arrested and the debts proven false, looks like you're free to build whatever life you want." Evangeline looked around the street where she'd faced her final test, at the faces of people who'd become family, at the man who'd shown her that love was possible even after loss. Then she smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Now I go home," she said simply. "Home to Willow Creek Ranch, where there's a piano waiting for me to play it, cattle waiting for me to sing to them, and a future waiting for me to help build it." As they walked back toward their horses and the life that awaited them in the valley beyond Deadwood, Evangeline McKenna felt the last chains of her past fall away. She was no longer the desperate woman who'd sold her mother's dress for a meal, no longer the frightened girl running from debts that were never truly hers. She was a rancher's wife, a member of a community, a woman who'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by what she'd lost, but by what she chose to build from the ashes of her former life. The snow had stopped falling, and in the distance, she could see the sun breaking through the clouds, painting the world in gold and promising that spring would come again, as it always did, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities and the endless music of life beginning again. Behind them, Deadwood settled back into its routine, but the story of the woman who'd faced down a fraud with nothing but courage and truth would be told around winter fires for generations to come. And in a valley 20 miles south, a piano waited in a warm house, ready to sing the songs of a love that had conquered fear and a future that stretched bright and welcoming toward the horizon.